The day my son passed away, I walked into the funeral home and felt the weight of silence pressing down on me. The air was thick with flowers and whispered condolences, but nothing could mask the sharp sting of betrayal I sensed in the room. Helen, my son's widow, leaned close to Mark, her eyes sparkling with a cruel amusement, and I heard her voice, cold and mocking. "I'll enjoy his $12 million far better than he ever could." I froze, my hands tightening around the edge of the polished oak casket, and called out softly, "Helen, please. This isn't the time." Mark just smirked, tipping his head as if savoring every word. My heart sank as whispers slid across the polished marble floors, the mourners glancing between us awkwardly. "Dad, you okay?" my daughter-in-law's younger brother, Peter, asked quietly, noticing my stillness. I took a slow breath and said, "I'll be fine. Just need a moment." A faint chuckle drifted from the other side of the room, Helen leaning back with that same smirk. "Don't worry, old man. You won't see a penny." I clenched my jaw, my vision narrowing to the glint of her bracelet, her lips twisting in that casual cruelty. I wanted to say something sharp, to make them understand the depth of my hurt, but I stayed still, letting the tension stretch between us like a taut wire. At that moment, I silently vowed they hadn't seen the last of me. I turned slowly toward the gathered crowd and softly said, "If this story speaks to your heart, please like and subscribe, and leave a comment with the city or country you're watching from and the current local time. Only if this story truly resonates with you." My name is Jonathan Reed. I'm 72, and this night, the night of my son Adam's funeral, changed everything in our family. I had spent decades building a life, a home, and watching my children grow, and yet here, at the moment of farewell, the very people I trusted most mocked what I held dear. And the real story, the one that shows who we truly are when faced with greed and betrayal, begins 2 weeks earlier, when I first noticed the subtle shifts, the whispers behind closed doors, and the faint, telling glances that would eventually lead to a revelation I was not prepared for. But before I can tell you how it all began, you need to understand the silence in that room, the sharp taste of injustice, and the weight of watching your child's legacy threatened by those who should have loved him. As I stood there, barely breathing, I caught Mark's eye once more, and in that brief exchange, I knew there was a truth they were desperate to hide, a truth that would not stay buried for long, and one that would change every memory I had of this family forever. I remember the first time I saw Adam when he was barely 3 years old, his small hands clutching the handle of a wooden wagon, pulling it across the backyard in our home in Cambridge, Massachusetts. The autumn leaves swirled around him, and I could hear his delighted laughter echoing through the crisp air as he shouted, "Watch me, Dad," to his father, Robert, who was kneeling by the porch, camera in hand, capturing every moment. I watched them, my heart swelling with pride, as Adam stumbled and fell, and Robert scooped him up effortlessly, whispering, "You are brave, just like me." That day, I realized the world I was building for my son was more fragile than I had imagined, balanced on the careful threads of love, trust, and guidance. Even then, the subtle dynamics of our family were forming. Helen, who would later become Adam's widow, often lingered in the background during our visits, offering smiles that seemed warm but carried a hint of calculation. At dinner one evening, when Adam was 6, he asked if we could make apple pie together, and I said, "Of course, sweetheart. We will make the best pie in the neighborhood." Helen, standing beside the counter, added casually, "I will help too, so it is perfect." Her tone was polite, but there was a way she looked at me that made me question her sincerity. I brushed it aside, believing every child needs a step of guidance and every adult their share of oversight. Over the years, patterns emerged, birthday parties where Adam's friends arrived promptly, but I noticed Helen whispering into Robert's ear, pointing at me occasionally, and once, when Adam turned 9, she rearranged the seating at the dining table without telling anyone, placing herself next to Adam and subtly pushing me to the far side. I looked across at him, sensing the slight confusion in his eyes, and said softly, "It is all right, Adam. Sometimes grown-ups make little changes, but nothing changes how much I love you." He smiled faintly, but I could feel the dissonance growing, the seeds of favoritism and exclusion subtly planted over time. One rainy afternoon, while the three of us were decorating the Christmas tree, Helen suggested rearranging the ornaments, and when I placed a shiny red bauble, she moved it to a less prominent branch, glancing at me with a smile that did not reach her eyes. I wanted to ask why, to demand honesty, but I simply nodded and said, "It looks beautiful now," keeping my voice steady, hiding the irritation that stirred in my chest. These seemingly small moments, the shifted chairs, the whispered instructions, the unspoken rules, all accumulated like shadows behind the cheerful laughter of our home. I began to notice how Adam sometimes hesitated, watching her cues more than his own impulses, and how the warmth of our family photographs held a subtle tension, a layering of smiles masking unspoken alliances. Sitting alone in the quiet of my study one night, I reflected on these incidents, turning them over in my mind like puzzle pieces that did not yet fit together, sensing that what I was observing was only the tip of a larger, unfolding story. The real complexity, the part that would lead to the deepest hurt and eventual revelation, was quietly taking shape around us, unnoticed by Adam, unnoticed by the neighbors, yet foreshadowing the challenges that would soon test the limits of trust, loyalty, and the very bonds of family itself, leaving me with a quiet question that lingered in my heart and would not be answered until much later. The morning after the tension at the funeral, I sat alone in the sunlit kitchen of my home inn, Cambridge, the scent of freshly brewed coffee mingling with the faint aroma of baked cinnamon rolls. I watched the steam curl from the mug, my hands wrapped around it as if the warmth could anchor me. Normally, I would have reacted immediately, a sharp word or a pointed glance to correct any slight or injustice. But today, I remained still, letting the quiet settle over me. My sister, Evelyn, stopped by unexpectedly, her brow furrowed, sensing that something had shifted. "John, I saw what happened yesterday," she said softly, placing a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "You cannot let them think they can do that to you without consequence." I nodded, feeling a spark of clarity for the first time. "I know," I replied, my voice measured, steady. "I need to understand it all first." Evelyn glanced around the kitchen, eyes landing on the photographs of Adam growing up, the smile frozen in each frame. "You always put everyone else first. Maybe it is time to put yourself first." I allowed a faint smile, the first in hours, but said nothing more. Later, I made my way to the local law office where Adam's will was being reviewed, a stack of documents lying neatly on the mahogany desk. I listened carefully as the attorney, Martha, explained the legal implications of certain clauses, her voice calm but precise. "Helen has some unexpected claims," she said, eyes narrowing slightly. "But there are gaps in the documents, things that could work in your favor if handled correctly." I leaned back in my chair, considering each word, my mind weaving strategies silently. "We will take it step by step," I murmured. On my drive home, I noticed the early spring sunlight catching the tips of the budding trees along Harvard Street, and I realized that something in me had shifted. The helplessness of yesterday was giving way to a measured determination. Back at home, Mark called, attempting to schedule a meeting under the guise of reconciliation, his voice smooth and rehearsed. "John, perhaps we can talk this over and come to an understanding," he said. I paused, not replying immediately, allowing the silence to fill the line, a subtle assertion of control. "We will see," I finally said, letting the words hang, deliberate, cool. As the day progressed, small signs of recognition began to surface. Neighbors mentioned Helen's conspicuous efforts to document Adam's estate, and Evelyn shared discreet notes she had overheard from family conversations. I pieced together each fragment, the picture becoming clearer with every detail. By the late afternoon, as the sun dipped behind the rooftops, I felt a tentative shift, a sense that I was stepping into a position of influence I had not realized I could claim. The opportunities were subtle but undeniable, each interaction a chance to guide the outcome rather than react to it. And yet, there was an underlying tension, a sense that Helen and Mark had not yet revealed all they knew or all they planned, leaving me with a quiet anticipation, the feeling that the next encounter would bring a revelation, one that could either solidify my understanding or shock me in a way I could not yet foresee. By mid-morning, the tension I had sensed in the previous days began to crystallize into undeniable clarity. I sat at the kitchen table, the sun streaming through the blinds and illuminating the stacks of mail and paperwork Adam had left behind. A letter from a financial advisor caught my eye, and as I opened it, I realized that several transfers of substantial funds had been redirected without my knowledge. I felt the first tight twist of betrayal in my chest, a familiar ache from long years of nurturing and trusting those closest to me. I picked up my phone and called Martha, my lawyer and old friend of the family. Martha, some of these accounts do not match the information I have. I believe Helen has been manipulating things, I said, my voice steady despite the storm inside. She paused, then replied, John, this is serious. We need to gather everything and document it carefully. Later that afternoon, Helen stopped by unannounced, wearing a bright smile and carrying a box of cookies. I thought you might enjoy a little treat, John, she said, placing the box on the counter. I nodded politely, observing the slight hesitation in her movements and the way her eyes flicked toward the financial papers I had left out. Thank you, Helen, I replied calmly, taking a deep breath. It is always thoughtful of you to bring something. As she lingered, I noticed subtle changes in her tone, the casual slip that suggested she assumed I was unaware of her maneuvers. By the way, the bank confirmed that the transfers went through perfectly. You did not need to worry at all, she added, her smile bordering on condescending. I felt a pang, realizing how deeply her false assurances had been trusted by those around her, including some of our closest family friends. I said nothing, pouring a cup of tea, letting her words hang in the air, each one a thread in the web of deception I was beginning to untangle. After she left, I reviewed the bank statements meticulously, tracing each transaction, each small redirection that Helen had orchestrated. The shock grew as I discovered multiple layers of manipulation, small lies built into larger schemes, all designed to present a facade of innocence while consolidating control over Adam's assets. The realization hit me like a winter chill. The betrayal was not a single act, but a carefully cultivated pattern, one that had gone unnoticed because of trust and my long-standing habit of assuming goodwill. I leaned back, letting the documents fall from my hands, the magnitude of the deceit unfolding before me, and felt the quiet collapse of certainty in my life. The letters, emails, and casual reassurances had been nothing more than instruments to manipulate perception, and in that moment, the structure of my family world, the balance I had relied upon, began to feel as though it was crumbling, leaving me with the profound awareness that the next steps I took would define not only the outcome of Adam's estate, but the very nature of justice and truth in the life we had built together. The days that followed felt strangely quiet, not because the conflict had disappeared, but because it had spread into places I could not easily reach. I refused to sit still. I started with phone calls. I called Helen 3 times over the course of a week. Each call went straight to voicemail. The first message was calm. Helen, I think there are misunderstandings that need to be cleared up. Please call me back. The second was more direct. We owe it to Adam to handle this honestly. The third was simply silence for a moment before I said, I am still your family. She never responded. Then I sent emails. I carefully wrote every word, reading each message twice before pressing send. I attached copies of documents, highlighted discrepancies, and asked simple questions that deserved simple answers. Days passed. Nothing. Eventually, I received a reply, but it was not from Helen. It came from an attorney representing her interests. The message was short, formal, and cold. It informed me that future communication should go through legal channels. I stared at the screen for a long time. 40 years of family dinners, birthdays, holidays, and shared memories had been reduced to a legal disclaimer. I tried another approach. I wrote a handwritten letter. I used the same fountain pen Adam had given me on my 70th birthday. I told Helen about the day Adam learned to ride a bicycle. I reminded her of the family vacations to Cape Cod. I wrote about forgiveness, about truth, about doing the right thing while there was still time. 2 weeks later, the letter came back unopened with a yellow postal sticker across the front. Return to sender. Unable to deliver. I turned the envelope over in my hands and felt something inside me sink. Around the same time, I began noticing changes among extended family members. Cousins stopped returning calls. Family friends who once greeted me warmly now seemed distant. At a grocery store, an old neighbor looked uncomfortable when I waved. John, he said awkwardly. I heard things have been difficult. What things? I asked. He hesitated. People are saying you are trying to take everything away from Helen. I felt my stomach tighten. That is not true. He nodded politely, but I could see uncertainty in his eyes. The story had already spread. Someone had been talking. Someone had carefully shaped a narrative that cast me as the problem. Even Evelyn noticed it. One evening she sat across from me at my dining table and shook her head. I cannot believe how many people accepted the story without asking questions. I looked down at my untouched coffee. Most people believe the version they hear first. She reached across the table. Then tell them the truth. I smiled sadly. The truth does not travel as fast as gossip. As the weeks passed, every attempt to repair the damage seemed to collapse before it could begin. Phone calls ended in silence. Emails disappeared unanswered. Letters returned unopened. Conversations became uncomfortable. I would sit alone in my house at night, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hallway. The rooms felt larger than they used to. The silence felt heavier. For the first time in my life, I realized that betrayal does not just take people away from you. It can convince the rest of the world to step back as well. And sitting there alone in the darkness, surrounded by memories and unanswered questions, I began to understand what true isolation felt like. I spent long hours sitting in the dim light of my study, the gentle hum of the heater filling the spaces between my thoughts. The reality of Adam's absence was crushing in a way I had not fully allowed myself to feel before. I looked around the room, at the photographs lined neatly on the shelves, the baseball mitt he had left on the top of the cabinet, and I whispered, "I cannot believe you are gone, Adam." The silence answered me back, thick and suffocating, as if the house itself was grieving. I called Martha, my lawyer, again, not for legal advice this time, but for human connection. "I feel so alone, Martha," I admitted softly. She sighed, her voice carrying warmth through the line. "John, I know. It is heavy. You have endured more than most could bear." I hung up and stared at the table, a stack of unopened letters from Helen and various financial institutions looming in front of me, each one a reminder of how abandoned I had been. Even Evelyn, my sister, had stopped coming by as often, cautious not to step into the growing tension, leaving me isolated in ways that cut deeper than any open confrontation could. One evening, I ventured outside, walking the familiar path to the corner store, and I heard neighbors whispering, their eyes darting away when they noticed me. "John," one muttered, "things are complicated now." I nodded quietly, realizing that every attempt to explain or justify myself was met with avoidance or doubt, that the story spun by Helen had reached far beyond the walls of my own home. Returning, I found a note slipped under the door. "We expect you to respect boundaries, John. Leave financial matters to us." The handwriting was elegant, yet cold, deliberate. I folded the note slowly, feeling the weight of betrayal sink into every corner of my chest. I spoke aloud to the empty room. I did not imagine it would feel like this, abandoned by those I trusted most. The clock ticked steadily, each second a reminder that life moved on outside my walls while I remained suspended in grief. I made one more attempt, dialing the family line to speak with Helen directly, but the call went unanswered, leaving only a recorded message urging me to communicate through email. I stared at the blinking light, recognizing that this isolation, this forced separation, was more than circumstantial. It was a calculated distance, a wall built with silence and disregard. As night settled in, I sat by the window, looking out at the faint glow of streetlights, and I felt the profound emptiness of being both present in the world and unseen by it. And yet, within that depth of loss and solitude, I sensed the first faint stirring of resolve, a quiet understanding that the shadows of this isolation might guide me toward clarity, toward a path where I could finally reclaim not just the truth about Adam's estate, but the dignity and voice that had been quietly stripped from me. The next Monday, I woke up before sunrise for the first time in weeks without feeling crushed by the weight of the previous day. The house was still quiet, but the silence no longer felt like an enemy. I made a pot of coffee, opened the curtains, and sat at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad. Instead of rereading old letters or reviewing painful memories, I began making a list. By 8 o'clock that morning, I had written down every unfinished project I had abandoned during the chaos of the previous months. At the top of the page was something Adam and I had talked about for years, but never found time to pursue. We had always wanted to create a scholarship fund for local students interested in engineering and business. I stared at the words for several minutes before picking up the phone. "Good morning, Cambridge Community Foundation," a woman answered. "My name is John Reed," I said. "I would like to discuss creating a scholarship program." There was a brief pause before she replied warmly, "We would be honored to help you with that." It was a small conversation, but when I hung up, I felt something I had not felt in a very long time. Purpose. Over the following weeks, I threw myself into work. Not because I needed the money. Not because I was trying to prove anything. I simply needed to build something that belonged to me. Every morning, I drove to local organizations, met with administrators, reviewed paperwork, and spoke with young people about their goals. One afternoon, a college student named Ethan sat across from me at a conference table. "Mr. Reed, why are you doing this?" he asked. I smiled. "Because someone once believed in my son, and because I think every young person deserves the same chance." Ethan nodded slowly. "Most people talk about helping. You are actually doing it." His words stayed with me for days. Meanwhile, something else began changing. People who had disappeared started noticing my work. Old acquaintances began calling again. Community leaders invited me to events. One evening, while attending a charity dinner in Boston, I heard someone say my name across the room. I turned and saw Richard Morrison, a businessman I had not spoken to in nearly 10 years. "John," he said, shaking my hand firmly, "I have been hearing impressive things about what you are building." I laughed quietly. "I'm just trying to stay busy." "No," he replied. "You are rebuilding your life." That sentence hit me harder than he realized. Because he was right. For the first time, I was no longer spending every day reacting to loss. I was creating something new, something meaningful, something that did not depend on anyone's approval. Evenings became different. Instead of sitting alone replaying old conversations, I reviewed scholarship applications, attended meetings, and developed plans for future projects. The grief never disappeared completely. I still missed Adam every day, but now his memory pushed me forward instead of holding me in place. Then one Friday afternoon, as I was preparing documents for the foundation, Martha called. Her voice sounded different, more energized, more urgent. "John," she said, "I just received information that changes everything." I slowly set down my pen. "What kind of information?" There was a brief silence on the line. Then she said, "The kind that could turn this entire situation upside down." And for the first time in months, I realized that the future might hold something far greater than recovery. By the time the next week arrived, I had established a rhythm that carried me from morning to evening with purpose. My office, a modest space in the heart of Boston's downtown, now held a small plaque on the door. Jonathan Reed, Community Programs Director. The letters glinted softly in the sunlight streaming through the window, a tangible marker of authority and achievement I had carved from the ashes of loss. I walked in wearing a tailored navy blazer, the crisp white shirt underneath symbolizing a clarity and order I had not felt in months. The first task of the day was to meet with Eleanor, a young program coordinator, to review the progress of the scholarship applications. "John, I have the latest batch of applications ready for your review," she said, sliding a neatly organized binder across the polished oak desk. I nodded, lifting it carefully. "Thank you, Eleanor. Let us see who might benefit most from this opportunity." I replied, scanning each name, each story, imagining the young lives we could impact. Later, during a community board meeting, I stood at the podium, the badge pinned neatly on my lapel catching the light as I addressed a room of educators, parents, and local officials. "It is our responsibility," I began, voice steady and confident, "to ensure that potential is nurtured, not overlooked, regardless of background or circumstance." Heads nodded, hands scribbling notes, eyes attentive, and I felt the weight of past frustrations ease slightly under the affirmation of recognition. Afterward, Richard Morrison approached me with a grin, extending a hand. "John, the way you have handled everything has been remarkable. Your vision is clear, and your leadership is inspiring." I shook his hand firmly. "Thank you, Richard. It is not about me. It is about giving these students the chance they deserve." That afternoon, back in my office, I glanced at the framed photo of Adam sitting on the steps of our Cambridge home years ago, smiling with a twinkle in his eye. I placed it on the desk where I could see it clearly, a reminder of why I was doing this. Why I had rebuilt not just a career, but a purpose. Later, on a brief coffee break in the lobby, a young student approached me timidly. "Mr. Reed, I just wanted to say thank you. Your scholarship is going to allow me to attend college this fall." I smiled warmly, the familiar surge of pride and hope settling in my chest. "You are welcome. Make the most of it. And remember, your effort is as important as opportunity." Returning to my office, I updated records, reviewed plans for the next initiative, and noticed a subtle message from Martha. "John, new developments may affect Helen's position," it read. I paused, sensing the ripple of change, a reminder that while I had achieved stability and influence, the past was still near enough to require vigilance. Yet, for the first time in weeks, I sat back in my chair, feeling the room as a space I had claimed through resilience and careful action, a place where my decisions shaped outcomes, and where the future was no longer defined by betrayal, but by the strength I had cultivated. The sunlight falling across the desk caught the edges of papers, charts, and photographs, a quiet signal that the next chapter, connected to both the present and the revelation still to come, was ready to begin. The morning sunlight filtered softly through the blinds of the hospital waiting room, and I felt the weight of anticipation pressing against my chest. I had requested a private meeting with the trustee handling Adam's estate, knowing that Helen and Mark would be there, confident in their manipulations, unaware that I had already anticipated each step. As I walked toward the conference room, my navy blazer crisp against my shoulders and the badge on my lapel catching the light, I reminded myself to breathe slowly, to keep the tension in check. The door opened, and there they were. Helen, immaculate in a tailored cream suit, Mark standing beside her, exuding the same overconfidence I had seen at the funeral. The room smelled faintly of coffee and polished wood, and the documents lay neatly stacked on the table between us. "Good morning, everyone," I said, my voice steady, calm, carrying authority. Helen's lips pressed into a thin line, Mark's eyes glinting with that same overconfident spark. "Morning, John," Helen said coolly. "We are just here to finalize everything. I trust you have all the documents ready." I nodded, sitting down deliberately, my hands folded atop the polished surface. "Yes, let us review the records carefully." As the trustee began to speak, presenting the schedules and summaries, I noticed small slips in Helen's posture. A brief hesitation when the transfers were mentioned, the way her eyes flicked to Mark as if seeking reassurance. I allowed the room to settle into an almost deafening quiet, each movement deliberate, each glance weighted. "I would like to start by clarifying the discrepancies noted in the February account statements," I said softly, leaning forward, my gaze fixed on both of them. Mark shifted uncomfortably, his hand brushing the edge of the table. "That is a misunderstanding," he replied, a note of uncertainty threading through his tone. I did not respond immediately, allowing the pause to extend, the silence thick, almost tactile. "We will go through this step by step," I continued, my voice calm, precise. "Each transaction, each authorization, is on record. I would appreciate complete transparency from all parties involved." The tension tightened, the trustee adjusting his glasses, sensing the delicate balance shifting subtly in my favor. Helen's jaw clenched almost imperceptibly, Mark's hand curled into a loose fist at his side, and I knew in that instant that the control I had been slowly reclaiming over the past weeks was coming to a head. I leaned back slightly, folding my hands, keeping my expression neutral, letting the anticipation build, the rhythm of conversation slow and measured, while beneath it all, a quiet power settled around me. Every detail I had gathered over the weeks, the bank statements, emails, correspondence, careful notes from Martha, was now converging in this room, waiting for the exact moment to reveal the depth of the truth. And just as the trustee lifted the next document, I realized the tipping point was near, the moment where pretense would fracture, and the reality I had painstakingly prepared to expose would finally unfold, leaving everyone in the room suspended in a fragile, tense expectation. The moment arrived with a quiet intensity that made every heartbeat audible. I laid out the documents on the polished table, each one carefully annotated with notes and evidence that demonstrated the sequence of transactions, the inconsistencies, and the unauthorized transfers. Helen and Mark sat across from me, their posture stiff, the overconfidence of days past beginning to waver ever so slightly. I began, my voice calm but unwavering. I have gone through the records thoroughly, and there are clear discrepancies in the handling of Adam's accounts. Helen's lips pressed together, and Mark's eyes flicked to hers as though seeking a signal. What do you mean? Helen asked, attempting to maintain composure, but the edge in her voice betrayed the first crack in her armor. I lifted a folder and slid it across the table. Each unauthorized transfer, each misrepresented entry, every instruction that was executed without proper authorization is documented here. I paused, letting the weight of my words settle. The trustee shifted in his chair, glancing at Helen and Mark, noting the subtle tension. John, are you certain about this? He asked. I nodded slowly, meeting his gaze. Every statement has been verified, every fact cross-checked. There is no ambiguity. Mark leaned forward slightly, attempting to mask his unease. This is just a misunderstanding. You must have misread something. I looked directly at him, unwavering. No, Mark. The evidence is clear. The actions taken were deliberate, and the chain of events proves intent. A moment of silence stretched across the room, thick and heavy. Helen's eyes flickered downward, unable to maintain her previous stance, and I saw the first real signs of panic, the tightening of her fingers against the armrest. I continued, my tone calm but incisive. I am not here to accuse without cause. I am here to ensure that Adam's legacy is preserved, and that those who have manipulated the process are held accountable. The trustee nodded, pulling copies of the evidence toward him for review, his expression revealing the gravity of what was unfolding. Slowly, Helen spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I did not think anyone would notice. The words hung in the air like fragile glass. I leaned back slightly, maintaining calm, and said, it is not about noticing. It is about taking responsibility. The room was silent again, the tension palpable, and I realized that in this stillness, the shift in control was complete. They had assumed I would be passive, that I would accept their version of events. Instead, they now understood that I had not only observed, but I had meticulously documented, verified, and prepared. The quiet authority I exuded filled the space, leaving Helen and Mark visibly unsettled. As the trustee adjusted his glasses, reviewing the material for the final time, Helen's voice wavered again. I suppose we have no choice. I nodded, calm and resolute. That is correct. The truth leaves no room for assumptions. And in that pause, as their expressions fell from smug certainty to uneasy acknowledgement, a quiet shock reverberated through the room. The realization that control had shifted irrevocably, and that the narrative they had carefully constructed to manipulate everyone else had unraveled completely, leaving them exposed to the consequences of their actions and setting the stage for a reckoning they had not anticipated. The consequences began almost immediately, not because anyone suddenly developed a conscience, but because facts have a way of moving through a family faster than rumors once they are backed by evidence. The trustee completed his review within days, confirming that the documentation Martha had uncovered from bank records, authorization logs, and archive communications was legitimate and verifiable. Every conclusion had a source. Every claim had proof. There was no room left for interpretation. A week later, I received a call from my cousin Daniel, a man who had barely spoken to me in months. John, he said quietly, I owe you an apology. I sat at my desk looking out over the Boston skyline. For what? I asked. There was a long pause. For believing things without asking questions. I should have called you. I thanked him, but the truth was I felt very little satisfaction. An apology could not restore trust once it had been broken. Similar conversations followed. An old family friend left a voicemail. A neighbor stopped me outside a coffee shop. Even people who had avoided me suddenly seemed eager to reconnect. The strange thing was that I no longer felt desperate for their approval. Somewhere along the way, I had stopped needing it. Then Helen requested a meeting. Martha called first. You are not obligated to go, she said. I know, I replied, but I think I should hear what she has to say. We met in a quiet conference room overlooking the Charles River. The atmosphere was completely different from our previous encounters. Helen looked tired, not defeated, just tired. She sat across from me and folded her hands together. I made mistakes, she said softly. I listened without interrupting. I kept telling myself I was protecting my future. Then everything became about control. I stopped seeing the consequences. I nodded slowly. That happens when people start treating relationships like transactions. Her eyes lowered. Do you think you can forgive me? The question hung between us. I considered it carefully before answering. Forgiveness and trust are not the same thing. She looked up. What does that mean? I folded my hands on the table. It means I do not want to spend the rest of my life carrying resentment. But it also means things cannot go back to the way they were. For the first time, she seemed to understand. There was no anger in my voice. No triumph. Just clarity. Later that evening, I met Evelyn for dinner. We sat beside the window of a small restaurant in Cambridge that Adam used to love. You seem different, she said while stirring her tea. I smiled. I am. Because you won? She asked. I shook my head. No. Because I finally stopped fighting for a seat at tables where people did not value me. She leaned back and nodded thoughtfully. That sounds like peace. Maybe it was. Maybe it was something close to it. Yet as I drove home that night and pulled into my driveway, I noticed a large envelope resting against my front door. There was no return address, just my name written neatly across the front. I picked it up, feeling its unexpected weight, and for reasons I could not explain, a quiet uneasiness settled into my chest. Because after everything that had happened, I knew one thing for certain. Not every truth had been uncovered yet. A few weeks after I found that envelope, life settled into something I had not experienced in a very long time. Peace. Not perfect peace. Not the kind that erases scars or rewrites painful chapters, but the kind that comes when you stop fighting battles that no longer belong to you. The envelope contained a handwritten letter from Adam that had been stored with other estate documents and released later through the trustee. It was written months before his passing. In it, he spoke about responsibility, integrity, and the importance of protecting the people you love from becoming prisoners of money. He wrote that wealth could build opportunities, but character was what determined whether those opportunities became blessings or burdens. I sat alone in my study and read that letter 3 times. By the third reading, I was no longer grieving the future I thought I had lost. I was grateful for the son I had been privileged to know. The scholarship foundation continued to grow. The first group of students graduated. Several returned to mentor younger applicants. One young woman stopped me after an event and said, Mr. Reed, because of this program, I became the first person in my family to earn a college degree. I smiled and congratulated her, but as she walked away, I quietly thanked Adam in my heart. The legal matters eventually reached their conclusion. Boundaries remained in place. Some relationships recovered partially. Others never did, and that was all right. One of the hardest lessons I learned is that healing does not always mean reconciliation. Sometimes healing means accepting reality and choosing peace anyway. Looking back now, I understand that the greatest loss was never financial. It was the loss of trust. And the greatest victory was never proving someone wrong. It was learning that my value did not depend on anyone else's opinion of me. For a long time, I believed that if I explained myself clearly enough, loved deeply enough, or sacrificed enough, people would treat me fairly. Life taught me something different. Healthy boundaries are not punishment. They are protection. Self-respect is not selfishness. It is survival. And forgiveness does not require access to your life. If you are listening to this story while carrying your own disappointment, betrayal, or heartbreak, I want to tell you something from the bottom of my heart. Please do not allow someone else's actions to become the measure of your worth. Protect your finances. Protect your emotional well-being. Pay attention to your instincts. Sometimes God places quiet warnings in our hearts long before our minds are ready to understand them. Trust those moments. Trust yourself. Most importantly, do not lose who you are while trying to save relationships that only survive when you disappear. Today, I wake up each morning with gratitude. I spend time with people who choose honesty over convenience. I invest in causes that matter. I laugh more than I used to. And when I think about Adam, I no longer focus on the pain of losing him. I focus on the gift of having known him. My name is Jonathan Reed. I am 72 years old, and the core lesson I want to leave with you is this. Never surrender your dignity in exchange for acceptance. As I finish telling this story, I am sitting beside the window in my study. On the desk rests Adam's old fountain pen, the same pen I used to write letters when everything seemed to be falling apart. The evening sun catches the silver trim, and for a moment it shines like a small light refusing to go out. Perhaps that is what resilience really is. Not becoming harder, not becoming colder, simply continuing to shine after the storm has passed. Thank you for spending this time with me. Thank you for listening, for sharing this journey, and for reminding me that none of us walk through difficult seasons completely alone. If this story touched your heart, feel free to leave a comment sharing where you are watching from and what lesson stayed with you the most. You are also welcome to share this story with someone who may need encouragement today, and subscribe if you would like to hear more stories like this. And if you enjoyed this journey, there are many more stories waiting in this playlist. Some begin with heartbreak and end with hope. Some reveal truths hidden for decades. Others explore the quiet strength ordinary people discover when life tests them in unexpected ways. Wherever you choose to go next, I hope you will join me for another story. Because sometimes the next lesson we need is waiting just one chapter